Welcome, everyone. Thanks so much for joining. My name is Mikey Mehenna. I'm the Executive Director of afikra. And today we have our special guest, Ghenwa, who is calling from, I think, from Chicago. I'm very honored to welcome our guest, Ghenwa Hayek, who is an Associate Professor of Modern Arabic Literature from the late 19th century to the present. Her work deals with the entangled relationship between literary and cultural production, space and place, and identity formation in the modern Arab Middle East. With a focus on Lebanon. We're going to get through your work. You have done a lot of interesting stuff, so I'm excited to have you on the show. Ghenwa, thank you so much for joining afikra Conversations.
Thanks for having me, and thanks to all of you for being here. And a shout out to my students, especially former students who don't have to be here.
Yeah, I'm so excited to have them on here too. So, Ghenwa, let's start with a little bit of a sort of biographical question.
Sure.
What brought you into studying this work, and specifically with a focus on Beirut?
So I grew up in Beirut. For those of you who know the city, I was raised in Beit Shabeb, which is a village in the mountains, but my schooling all happened in Ras Beirut. I went to IC and then to AUB, so I crossed through the gate and went to college. So I spent many, many years in Beirut. It's still home. And like any, I think, good Lebanese kid, I was supposed to be a scientist or a doctor. But 2 years into college, I realized that was not for me. And I am very lucky to have parents who understood my decision to become an English major.
How dare you?
So I transferred. AUB at the time I attended it did not really have a robust modern Arabic program. And so I mean, for those of you who are familiar with schooling in Lebanon, it isn't very Arabic intensive if you go to a school like IC. So I didn't really read any modern Arabic novels until I went to do my master's and felt very homesick. And I discovered an entire world that I had never heard of that was super fascinating, where people were having amazing ideas and writing. I mean, I've always loved books, but I realized that, you know, people who wrote in Arabic also wrote really interesting things. And that's what spurred me to become a comparatist and to think about what it means when people who write in different languages focus on particular topics. I didn't really stumble into the Beirut part of this project until quite late in my graduate studies. I came back to Beirut to do research in the archives in 2006, and after the war decided that I wanted to suspend my return to the US and my graduate schooling. I wasn't even sure if I wanted to continue with my PhD. And I spent 2 more years in Beirut in a moment where there were many intense conversations about the city and about whose city it was that triggered my curiosity. I mean, as a child of the 90s and and a sort of young adult in the early 2000s in Beirut, these conversations were always with us. And I became really interested in how quickly they had shifted from the 90s to the mid to late 2000s, the sort of the way people were talking about the city. And that sort of spurred my curiosity to find out how have people really been talking about Beirut since the founding of Beirut, or since the sort of rise of modern Beirut. And that's how I came into my topic.
Yeah, I think there's a great moment to sort of jump into this idea of this book, the thesis of this book.
Yeah.
And I think the first question I can sort of start with is, as I was reading through a lot of your work, and I mentioned this to you before the call, there's this idea or this term that you use, which is imagined geographies.
Right.
And maybe you can speak a little to that term, what that term means, and in what way is Beirut an imagined geography? And maybe Lebanon more broadly.
I mean, I would really say any place that we talk about or think about is kind of an imagined geography, in the sense that there's a disconnect between how we think about a particular place and how we experience it in our day-to-day. And this disconnect is particularly true, I think, if you're in any kind of cultural production, because, for example, a book set in contemporary Beirut will leave out, for example, unless they really want to, but mostly leave out constant kahraba interruptions and the potholes and the guy with the honking the horn at like 2:00 in the morning, and the sort of noise of the city and how irritating it can be to live in it. Films about California, where I also spent a bit of time in Southern California, films that depict Los Angeles will in their sort of opening scenes, will show you a Los Angeles that doesn't really exist, right? So you get the impression that you can go from the Hollywood sign to the beach in 3 minutes, right? And whereas really the reality is you spend 2.5 hours in traffic, gridlocked, in order to move anywhere around that city. So all places are, humans imagine and represent place in a particular way. And I think that this is, and they attach meaning to those places that are imagined. So I think that's my clumsiest description of what an imagined geography is.
No, that's perfect.
Yeah.
I guess, how has Beirut changed in our sort of cultural imagination over the last, maybe, you said modern Beirut, maybe try to define what modern Beirut is and how it's sort of changed in that time?
So this is a really difficult question. I don't know if I can actually answer how modern Beirut has changed.
Yeah.
I think what I tried to do in the book is to show that it has, even as people continue to say, nothing, and in some ways that's true, nothing changes in Beirut. So you read 19th century descriptions of Beirut and they're like, everyone in Beirut is dancing on its own ruins, and everything is going to fall apart. And, the city is just occupied with itself and with its own entertainment. And it's, they're not occupied with science and knowledge, and, and things are going to go wrong. And you hear this moralistic definition of the city, even till today, the Lebanese, they're always partying, they don't care about anything, blah, blah, blah. And at the same time, so there are some things that come back, they're very dynamic, and there are some things that change. I think we all, maybe less people who are younger than I am, but I grew up during the war and then with parents who spoke about the Beirut before the war all the time, and and would often say, it was this amazing place, you could wander around the Aswaq and the Burj, and it was wonderful and vibrant, and of course these stories, it might be true, this is how they experience them, but they're also a particular kind of nostalgic imagining of a city that probably wasn't quite like that, right? And when they're imagining it, when people of my parents' generation are imagining it, they're not thinking about, for example, the sort of enclosures of poverty around the city, or that it might not have felt the same way for someone who was born and raised in a refugee camp, or on the outskirts, or, so I've always been interested in sort of trying to uncover in that particular moment, what were the things that were being said and how they were being said, and what were the feelings that attached to the particular kinds of descriptions. And I think the Beirut of today, Beirut this year has been particularly sad.
Yeah.
It's very difficult to sort of be far away and watch what's happening. Yeah. But even the Beirut of 2015 was different than it had been 10 years ago, right? And different to what it was like before I left for grad school in 2003. Yeah. So,
my impression is that there's an illusion of stasis, right? that things have always been this way. Even
Correct.
an illusion that Beirut has been the most important city in what is now considered Lebanon, that alone is a huge illusion, right?
Correct.
That's a falsehood.
Yeah.
And so one of the other terms that you mention in this book that I love is mountain romanticism, right?
Right.
And the duality between the rural in Lebanon, which is often related to the mountains, and the urban, and those two spaces. Can you talk a little bit about that? Like, walk me through what you're trying to unpack in the book with that concept.
So mountain romanticism is an amazing term. It's not my own. It's Chris Stone's and Jens Hansen's. And but the idea is, well, the idea was that until the creation or until Lebanese independence, so until about the mid-century, the dominant way of describing Lebanon was describing the mountain, right? The mountain as a site of purity, of wonderful. If we think about, for example, the novels of Emil Rihani, or we think about the stories of Emil Rihani, if we even think about Gibran, if we think about some of the poetry that comes, from the French schools in the 1920s, so Charles Currum, La Montagne Inspirée, it's all about creating an image of Lebanon that is about the mountain and the sort of purity of the mountain folk and the greatness of the mountain, right? It's very entwined also with a kind of identity that people wanted to create for Lebanon and the Lebanese. And it's, to be fair, a mostly sectarian identity at the time.
For sure.
And so, I mean, the broad brushstrokes that we were taught was that, that Lebanese literature is about the mountain. And when I started investigating, I realized, like, when I went back to the mid to late 19th century, I realized that people were writing novels about Beirut all the time at a moment where Beirut itself was becoming a city. And that was really interesting, right? They were sort of thinking what it means to be Beiruti, what it means to inhabit the city. They were making distinctions between urban life and rural life that were kind of really interesting. Another way to think about this is also, I don't know if you're all familiar with Fairuz and the movies and the songs, which are almost always about the village and how great the village is and how amazing Fairuz's family is because they have real village values. And, and then, something happens, right? And it's parodied in Ziad Rahbani, her son's work, right? From the 1970s and the 1980s. So even by the 70s, it was a parody, or it was, people realized that it was not true. But yet it continues. It continues to be taught. It continues to be expressed. So that's I think.
When we think about sort of the work that's being done, the literary work that's being done at the early part of the 20th century, how much of it is being written by people in exile, or not in exile, but outside of the current borders of Lebanon?
Quite a lot. The Lebanese diaspora, especially the Lebanese diaspora in North America, and earlier than that in Cairo and Alexandria, play a huge role in thinking about and writing about Lebanon. But at the same time, that doesn't mean that people based in Lebanon and in Beirut weren't writing. So if you go into the archives of any of the universities in Lebanon, you'll notice just how many journals there were and publications and how many submissions there were of stories and poems. And so people were actively writing in Beirut. They just, very few of them had the kind of impact that a figure like, for example, Gibran or Emil Rihani or Mikhail Nahaimi or any of the people that we think of when we think of the PEN Association, and those diasporic groups. Yes. So I don't know in actual numbers, but a sizable amount of people were writing, men and women.
Amazing. So before we move away from this book, I'm curious, like, when you structured, when you sort of put the book together, I'm always interested in asking people, who was this book for? You know, what was the audience? What were you trying to get people to sort of walk away with and keep thinking about? And how has it changed in the 10 years, I guess maybe 10 years since it came out, or 6 years since it came out?
About 6. Yeah. So who was it for? I think that I hoped that it would be read by academics and non-academics. I hope that it would be read by people who are interested in the city and interested in taking seriously some of the things we were just talking about earlier, that it's a dynamic place. It's a place that's imagined in particular ways, certain feelings attached to this imagining, and it's important to notice these feelings and to notice their shifts. And it really has changed. The city really has changed, right? And I wanted to unpack some of the stereotypes around the city. Really, I got, I was frustrated at the time with some of the language that was being used to describe Beirut. And I wanted to sort of dive deeper into it. And I hoped that the people who read it would be people who were willing to dive deeper into it with me.
It's amazing. One of the things that sort of kept on coming up since August 4th, and even before that, since the Thawra really began in Beirut, was this idea, or this falsehood, I think, that Beirut is a exclusively Lebanese city, right? And that the stories are exclusively Lebanese, and that we don't have Filipino stories and Armenian stories and Sri Lankan stories and Palestinian and Syrian stories here.
Right.
Have you, as somebody who probably has a sort of finger on the pulse of what's going on in the literature world and sort of cinema world coming out of Beirut, do you feel like that is changing slowly? Do you see some more of these stories emerge?
That's an interesting question. I mean, I think that it's a complex question because, for example, the Palestinian experience in Lebanon has been filmed, described, talked about by generations of Lebanese and Palestinians for decades now. So if you think about the documentaries that May Masri and Josh Amawa made in the 60s and the 70s up until, I think the most recent one was maybe 2015. The films of someone like Mehdi Fleifel, who was born in I think technically he wasn't born in Beirut, but he was raised in I forget which camp. I want to say Ain al-Halwa, but I'm not 100% sure. And sort of depicts multiple generations of people in the camp, but also leaving and coming back. So there are stories that have been represented. And there are communities that have written their own stories. I wish I could. I'm certain there must be Filipino stories or Ethiopian stories written in Tagalog or Amharic that I cannot read and I cannot access that might be fascinating about the experience. But and I will say that there is a representation now of migrant worker bodies on film, especially, that wasn't there before, or that were different kinds of bodies before. So in some of the novels from the 70s and the 60s, there's always a woman who works in the house, but she's often from Akkar or Syria. And in more recent novels, migrant labor domestic labor has become more associated with women who come from further away. But they're not really, I mean, these are bodies that are in these texts, but they're not really bodies with agency. Like, we don't really hear them speak or talk or think.
Or talk to each other.
Or get things, or talk to each other, or get things from their perspective. Yeah, I mean, I can think of, I mean, I haven't really watched it, but I know that Nadine Labaki's Capernaum has a depiction of several different kinds of, but I've heard that's problematic. So I can't talk to it until I watch it. So yeah. So it's not just about representation.
Yeah, one of the reasons why I brought it up was I came across this book. I think it's called Invisible Lives, or it's about it's written by a Pakistani guy who grew up in Abu Dhabi, and his parents, came as low-wage workers, and he grew up there, and now he's a professor at NYU Abu Dhabi, I believe. And it's a sort of a list of his short stories growing up there.
Yeah,
okay, I want to change gears a little bit and talk about some of your other work, and specifically this paper that is about this one short story.
Novel.
Is it a novel, or it's a novel? Yeah,
it's a
novel called "The Story of Zahra." Rather, sorry, excuse me. And this paper has like two pieces to it, right? There's this one idea about that you're trying to unpack about how sort of Arab voices or Lebanese voices can tend to otherize or fail in depicting the lives of Africans who are characters in the book. But then at the same time, it's also talking about the shortcomings of translation. Two maybe distinct things, but I'm really, really, really interested. So can you tell us a little bit about why you were drawn to this story and what I just got wrong about what you were trying to say?
No, I think you actually, I think your reading was quite astute. So for those of you who've not read it, Hikayat Zahra is a very famous novel from the start of the Lebanese civil war. Hanan al-Sheikh is one of the sort of most esteemed Lebanese novelists of her generation. And Hikayat Zahra was one of the first novels written by a woman about a woman's experiences during that particular conflict, right? So along with Ghada Samman and a few other women, female authors later, Hikayat Zahra tells the story of a woman who is, we understand that she's Shia, we understand that she is lower middle class, and she lives, she has some kind of mental illness. We're not sure what it is. She lives with her family. Her family are awful. At the beginning of the war, she, for a while, tries to escape her family by going to visit her uncle in an unnamed West African country. She gets married, she gets divorced, she comes back. She starts an affair with a sniper, and he eventually becomes pregnant by him, and then he kills her. He's a sniper.
I think you're supposed to say spoiler alert.
Sorry, spoiler alert. I just saved you reading the story of Zahra. No, I mean, it's a classic. Almost immediately after its publication, so in the mid-80s, people started writing about Hikayat Zahra. It's an electrifying novel. There's many things about it that are fascinating. By the time I got around to reading it in about the mid-2000s, I had heard so much about it. I read it, and I realized that a good 35% of the novel takes place in this West African country. But no one writes about it. None of its critics write about it. And then I mean, at the time, I wasn't really that interested in that particular topic because I was working on my Beirut book and I wanted to sort of focus on the Beirut parts of it. But it just kept gnawing at me. And then, I read the book in Arabic and I read the book in translation, and I saw that there was a big difference between there's a really interesting sort of shift in the language between the English and the Arabic. Recently, I just saw a Twitter thread that was really fascinating. Someone had noticed that, for example, in all of the sexual assault that takes place in Arabic, all of the words that describe forced sexual encounters in English are translated as made love. So it's a problematic translation for many reasons. But for me, what I found most interesting was the way that it translated some of the quite racist turns of phrase that the characters use to describe people who are African in the novel, and the way that in the English that shifts, that changes, right? So it's really watered down, so it seems more PC. And the sort of most interesting part of this for me is that the book, it's claimed, was co-translated by the author and this man, this shadowy man who may or may not have been the royal translator in England, and may or may not have worked in intelligence. People have been trying to track him down for years, and it's very difficult to track him down. So yeah, so that's. So the article was written with the sort of trying to sort of reinsert that entire African part of it, and to sort of to reckon with the gaps in our own scholarship and how we look at Arab novels, and to sort of think about the translation, right? This to sort of, like you said, to juggle between these two aspects of it.
Yeah. I want to read just one quote that you write in the paper, because I think you do a great job. You say, "I would argue that it is incumbent upon us to think more critically about Zahra's imaginative geography and the way its language represents African men as nameless drunkards, its women as mute sex objects, and its environment as one that infects or pollutes the bodies and minds of Lebanese immigrants." Did you get any pushback against this? What was the sort of reaction?
No, but I haven't really presented it in Lebanon. So, no. So this and the articles on cinema are part of a longer project, a book I'm currently writing about emigration in Lebanon and Lebanese culture, and the particular ways that emigration to Africa is depicted in a variety of Lebanese cultural productions, from film to novels to plays to poems, and the way that the continent of Africa then becomes the way in which Lebanese culture, mainstream culture, projects its own fears about emigration back to itself by sort of creating these characters, often these quote unquote Lebanese characters who return to Lebanon sick or damaged or blackened in particular ways. And it's sort of been it's been a journey, a fascinating journey. And of course, it's a journey that forces you to contend with very real racism, right? And the repercussions of language that we use thoughtlessly, or that people use thoughtlessly, and without justifying it or excusing it in any way, to sort of think critically with that discomfort, to sit with that discomfort and think that what could it mean? Why? I don't know if I have an answer, but yeah.
It's funny because the act of translation, in many ways, I think I can see how the act of translating it reveals these biases, right? These really problematic biases, because all of a sudden it's like it's out of context, and we're so used to that context, right? And so we don't hear it, and when it's translated, all of a sudden you feel like you have to dress down the racism to be like, oh, I didn't mean rape, I meant made love, Right.
Or I did not translate abid and abid to an offensive English term, but turn them into gypsies, because I don't want to sort of deal with, and what does that mean about the sort of the racial implications of using a term like gypsy in an Anglophone context, right? Sometimes I will say that when I talk about, especially, it's always interesting with translation, but when I talk about, one of the interesting things in Zahra, in language, is that Hanan al-Sheikh is very deliberate in the Arabic about when she's using aswad or zanji and when she's using abd. And she really wants to use abd to be as derogatory and as awful as that word really is. She uses it, her characters use it to hurt each other and to hurt other people. And so translating it all into the same word sort of reduces that, and it also makes it seem as if this text is not aware of how these words mean things in Lebanese culture and are used violently. And so, sometimes I do get pushback when I sort of bring out the, abd and the use of that derogatory term, which means slave, to describe any person of African descent in Arabic. And then I'm like, and then there's always the people who'll say, but Abdullah just means, the slave of God. It's not racist or offensive. It's just, it's just the word that we use, which is not true.
Yeah.
It is racist and offensive.
Like,
yes.
If his name's Abdullah, you can call him Abdullah.
Yeah.
Okay. I wanted to talk about this paper, about this trilogy. We have a lot of really good questions in the chat, so maybe we'll come back to it in the chat.
Thank you for asking questions, everyone.
Yeah. So let's actually get to the quick Q&A, and then we'll open up to the chat. So What are you reading or watching right now?
Oh, I just started Paranormal. I am reading detective fiction, not in Arabic. I'm hoping to read some Yusuf Habshi al-Ash'ar over Christmas break, but I need some time. Okay, that's enough.
Cool. Perfect. Who would you love to shadow, past or present?
This is a really good question. I think I would really have loved to spend a day with Salim Bustani, who lived in Beirut in the late 19th century. He was the editor and publisher of a journal called Al-Jinan. He's the son of a much more famous father, Butrus, who wrote Nafir Suriya, which was a polemic about the 1860 war, but also was instrumental in translating the Bible into Arabic, and also he wrote the encyclopedia.
Wait, why the son, not the father? It sounds like the father is...
Well, Salim edited Al-Jinan and then wrote these wonderful and wonderfully insane novels.
Cool. Wow.
He was very active. He died when he was 44. So he only outlived his dad by a year. Very tragic. And he wrote some of the earliest novels in Arabic. They're all romance novels. They're all lurid. Like, people are always having like intense emotions and fainting. And, the first one, Al-Hiyam fi Jinan al-Sham, involves like cross-dressing and pirates and people getting kidnapped by Bedouin. I mean, it's just a bit nuts. And I just think he would have been a fascinating person to shadow and
Sure.
Yeah, and see Beirut in like the late 19th century would have been interesting.
I'm sold. Okay.
Thank you.
What do people most misunderstand about your work, or your line of work? Either one.
Oh, my line of work. They think,
either one. Your work or your line of work, whatever you like.
I don't know if. I don't know if I have a solid idea of what people misunderstand about my own work, but my line of work, everyone thinks that people who are literary scholars just sit around and read books all day. And people have a very strange idea of what university professors do, including my own family, who don't think I actually work because they don't understand, how we have so much time off and
Why aren't you coming more often?
Yeah, well, not just that, but like you don't really, you don't do anything. You teach that one class for 1 hour every day, and then you just go home, right, and do nothing. Yeah. So yeah, I think that's mostly professionally what people most misunderstand about my work, that all I do is read, and I think that literature represents reality, and that I don't actually work. I do work. Okay. Just
you heard it here first. She works.
Yes.
Whose work do you admire or are inspired by?
This one is also a really good and really difficult one. I think that I thought about this, and I think that the person I owe the most to intellectually is Raymond Williams, who I'm in good company here because Edward Said was also a big fan. And I think that
you quoted him in the book, right?
I do. I quote him a lot. Yeah. So, I mean, what I admire the most about his work is that it's very eclectic. It makes a case for the importance of culture in understanding the world, and not in a simple way, but he actually makes a case for the fact that cultural production is a form of production, and it participates in shaping our world, and so we need to pay attention to it. And he's also, and to him I owe, I think, that, and also the sense that in order to pay attention to it, we really have to pay attention to language, have to pay attention to words, and we have to pay attention to what those words mean for the people who use them, and what they inspire in the people who hear them and read them and think about them. And that's not just intellectually, but also feelings. So he was really he's very foundational to a field that we now think of as affect studies. So scholars who pay attention to feelings, which has not always been true. And so, yeah, I think that if I had to pick one person, that would be the person.
Cool. Okay. We are going to open up the Q&A in the chat. We have a bunch of people. Farah, you're up first. Do you want to unmute yourself? There you go.
Thank you.
Yeah. Hi, Farah.
Hi, Ghenwa. This was super fascinating. I feel like I've learned so much.
Thank you.
40 minutes. It's really cool. And if you ever need help going through archives or something, please let me know.
Okay.
The question I have is, do you feel like we're now creating this new version of nostalgia, like before and after the August 4th blast? As in, we have like another generation that is now kind of reminiscing about a previous version of Beirut?
I mean, I think that's inevitable. And I think that one of the things that's really interesting about the August 4th blast is that it does a couple of things, right? First of all, I doubt anyone has ever paid attention to the port area as much as they have since August, right? Even before August, that entire area was mostly out of the general imagining of the city, especially in recent times. And I think that, but the areas around the port, so Jemaise, Maroun, were very much a part of the social fabric of a certain kind of Beirut lifestyle, and yes, and obviously there's sort of no glossing it. This is a huge catastrophe for everyone in the city and for the people of those neighborhoods, and a loss for the young people who love these spaces, who thought of them as spaces of liberation, as spaces of art and creativity. But I'll also say that I'm sort of really intrigued by the way, for example, that people are talking about those areas, but less so about like a place like Karantina, which was equally affected, right? So it'll be interesting in a few years, I think, once the crisis is less immediate, to sort of see, at least interesting for me, to see what spaces stick and become a short, what spaces become a shorthand, in the same way that for my parents' generation, for example, Burj is a shorthand for a certain kind of life, and for people who were student activists in the 60s, Al-Hamra is a certain kind of life. So yeah, I'd be curious about that. But yes, for sure.
Okay, sorry about that. There was a problem with the mic. First, thank you so much, Professor Hayek, for the wonderful talk. So my question is very very general, just kind of about the director Maroun Baghdadi's work, which I'm sure you're familiar with, in constructing like also the kind of imagination of Lebanon. And I'm thinking in particular his film Hamsat with Nadia Twaini, which kind of shows a fragmented Beiruti society that's also dispersed all around Lebanon, but also, speaking their narrative experiences, that's kind of like tying this fabric of like kind of a creation of a Beiruti identity within the film.
Right.
So just thinking about how those films are resurfacing now on Netflix, and there's like more kind of talk about it. Do you feel like this attempt to kind of, for his work to resurface is also an attempt to kind of strengthen our image of a Lebanese unity today?
Oh, that's a really good, fascinating question, Rawad. Thank you. And I don't know. I mean, I think that the decision to put the films up on Netflix, well, first of all, I welcome it because, these films have been really hard to find. And so as someone who's interested in cinema, I'm always excited when earlier cinema appears on streaming platforms. Are they an attempt to create unity? I'm not 100% sure because I'm not 100% sure who the audience for Netflix is. And so it's difficult for me to sort of assess that. I will say that I think that those films in particular play a very specific role in the way people in Lebanon and in the West imagine Beirut. And Hamsat particularly was fascinating because it seems to have been sponsored by a bank, which and I think Bank Med actually, or whatever Bank Med was before it became Bank Med, and it really is a slice of life of the elite, right? And one of the distressing things is how many members of that elite are still the elite today and sort of still around making messes. But it also gives us some of the most enduring iconography of Beirut, especially the Aswaq with like all the ruins and stuff. And that is an image that lasts way past the war and is how what a lot of people think about Beirut when they think about Beirut. So, yeah, but as much as like in terms of unity, I don't know.
Next, Sally.
Yes. Hello.
Hi.
Thank you so much for this fascinating discussion, Dr. Hayek.
Thanks, Sally.
So I have a question here about why is there anxiety towards Beirut and its representation in contemporary literature? Is it social or political anxiety, or simply nostalgia towards better times, maybe towards better past?
Thanks, Sally.
Yeah, that's a great question. When I defended this project, it was my dissertation. People there were like, well, you seem to write what you know. And apparently I'm a very anxious person because my next project is also about anxiety. So I think for me, this anxiety is about all of the above, Sally. I mean, we don't know where we're going. There's a sense, for example, in the comics that I look at in the last chapter of my book, they were mostly written after 2006. And I look at comics as a new way of writing about the city that is a development from older ways of writing about the city. So the sort of the romance novel or the novel of the war or the novel of history, the historical novel, and then comics. And I try to connect these kinds of writing that erupt in certain moments of the city's life with what's happening on the ground. And comics became a way for me to understand that post-2006 moment between 2006 and 2010, when people weren't sure what was going on, like there was 2008, there was, just before, there was a lot of violence and there was a lot of tension, and there was a lot of tension about the future and tension in the present. And the stories that a lot of these comics are about children realizing that they have more in common with their parents than they thought, because the war of 2006 that they experience as adults for the first time, these are children of war, they realize what their parents did to keep them safe and how they must have felt when these authors themselves were children. And so a lot of them are about intergenerational understanding and what does it mean to have to understand war twice across generations, and what does this mean for a future generation to have to understand that at any moment violence can happen in the city. And I think that this creates and produces and represents a kind of anxiety. So my best word for it is anxiety. It might not be a great word, but it is about those things. It's about, like, we live in a precarious place, right? Even before 2020, you don't know if your job is stable. You don't know if your landlord is going to kick you out. You don't know if if you have electricity to wash your clothes. Like all of these things, they create a kind of anxious writing.
It's true.
Yeah.
Okay. Thanks so much, Sally. We have Asia.
Yes. Thank you so much, Professor Hayek and Mikey, for hosting this talk. So my question is regarding to, let's say, rather cinema and like film studies. So we often say that cinema, or maybe visuals, they kind of have this better representation of Lebanon and how it is. But then at the same time, we have examples in literature where there is this also like this raw narrative. Perhaps if we can look at post like Civil War narratives, for example, I don't know, Ilyas Khoudi's White Faces. But then we never find that adaptation of literature is like this much predominant in the region or in Lebanon. And why is that? Why are the like ties between both domains still shy?
That's a brilliant question, and I wish I knew the answer, because I think now that you've mentioned it, like, I think an adaptation of White Masks would be fantastic. Like, I think it could be a movie, but it could also be sort of a series. Why? I don't know why. I don't know why, even though, so a lot of times our Lebanese authors have, like Naguib Mahfouz did in Egypt, for example, written film scripts. I would say that cinema in Lebanon is not that developed. There's a particular kind of story about Lebanon that is often told in cinema, and I think it has to do a lot of times with films are very, very, very expensive to produce. The money for cinema often comes from outside Lebanon. People who give this money often are looking for a particular kind of story. And so that might explain it. Lebanese novels are more local, more embedded, more difficult to bring to the cinema in a way that would be interesting. Or perhaps this is what they think, perhaps this is what screenwriters and adapters think, that it would be more difficult to bring to cinema in a way that would be interesting to audiences. But I don't really have a very good answer, honestly, besides that.
Great. Thanks, Asia. Zaina, I think Ghenwa answered your question about the translator, so I'm going to keep going. Omar, I'm going to unmute you.
Yes, hi, Dr. Ghenwa. Thank you for the fascinating talk. So my question is, do you think the minority representation, or actually I should say misrepresentation in Beirut, is part of a larger story across the Middle East? Whether that is in the Gulf countries or in Tunisia or elsewhere, and how would you envision kind of like correcting this misrepresentation?
Well, I think the correcting of the misrepresentation needs to happen through education, and education needs to happen, very early and very often and a lot. I mean, the way, for example, that children are brought up by migrant women whose lives they are, sort of completely uncurious about, and whose lives their parents are uncurious about and are often disrespected. I mean, the kafala system is awful and needs to end. I mean, there are sort of this question is a question that is so much more serious than representation. There are a lot of things in common. It's ironic, for example, that Lebanese people who work in the Gulf really hate the kafala system when it applies to them, but they don't actually notice that their own government does the same thing to other people. Like they feel entitled to it when it's happening in Lebanon. I think what I find the most interesting, honestly, about this question are the nuances of this. So Tunis and other North African countries have, because they are in the African continent, have had centuries of cultural intermingling that a place like Lebanon, particularly with regards to people from sub-Saharan Africa, has not. And so Lebanon is more ethnically homogeneous, although of course that doesn't mean that it's not diverse. It's historically been more ethnically homogeneous, let's put it this way. And so when the Lebanese started emigrating to West Africa, their encounter was framed in a different way than this encounter has been in Morocco or in Algeria or in Egypt with the Sudan. But they're often sadly racist, right? And there are many amazing people who do this work for the Sudan. There's Iftra Powell. For Morocco, there's Shouk El Hamel. And so I don't know if that really answers your question. That was kind of rambly, but off the top of my head, that's the best I can do right now.
Ghenwa, thank you so much for joining. We've run out of time. This was it zoomed by, and no pun intended. Everyone on the call, thanks so much. I posted 2 links into the chat. The first is a single question: was this good? If you can answer that and let us know your feedback, that's great. If you'd like to support afikra and help us keep going and growing, please consider becoming a member. And Ghenwa, thank you so much. This was really great.